this one had been coming for a while, so it's time to finally do it. So, alright. Listen, I was originally going to post this video in November, but then a few things happened that sort of made it kind of annoying. First off, I was planning two other videos around the same time so that I could kind of do like a part of like a mini series of videos, to go over some Destiny scaling. But the thing is, I was going over those videos and they would end up connecting back to this video, so I ended up having to scrap two or more whole videos entirely and just throwing them into this video. And then here's a whole other thing too. In fiction, you'll have characters who have feats and statements who scale that way. Then you have other characters who'll use hierarchy scaling. And then you'll have, other characters who scale via scaling to other characters in or below their tier. The thing is, for someone like Oryx, he has all these types of scaling. I'm serious. He has all of these types of scaling. You can make so many arguments for different scaling ends in Destiny, you'd be right. If you wanted to say it's 4D, 6D. If you want to say Destiny was high hyperversal, if you want to say it's 12D, if you wanted to say it's 10D, if you wanted to say it's outer versal, you can literally say all those and you'd be right. Because for Destiny, it has so many different scaling ends. And for someone like Oryx, he connects to a lot of those scaling ends because he is one of the strongest characters in his tier. So I had to literally go and discard like a whole 2 or 3 videos just to make this video on Oryx, which is why it's such a long ass video. So, fair warning before you go and, skip through the video because there is a lot that I'm going to go through. So, anyway, let's go ahead and cue the intro.
6 of you went down into the pit. You sought revenge for those I lost. You slew a god, Crota. With his last breath, he reached out across the night. And now, the night has answered. Oryx, Crota's father. He smells the blood of his son on your hands.
So as you could probably tell from the first minute or so, there's a whole lot that goes on with Oryx. First off, Oryx was 3 different people. There's a few different versions of who he was when he was born. There's a few different versions of who he was when he became a different person. And then there's the fact that he finally became Oryx the Taken King. And then there's different scaling ends for Oryx the Taken King. And then there's different areas of where his full power eventually was at within the Destiny lore. And then there's all the scaling from the rest of the game that goes on to Oryx scaling. Like, there's a whole lot that goes on with Oryx, as you could probably tell from the first minute of the video. So, I'm going to divide this video into several sections. So, first off, Oryx's scaling is comprised of the Books of Sorrow, it's comprised of the Taken King, it's comprised of the Dark Below. It is comprised of the House of Wolves, but the House of Wolves doesn't really do all that much, even though there is scaling there. There's a whole lot to talk about with Forsaken. There's a whole lot to talk about with even Shadowkeep. Then there's the Beyond Light stuff. Then there's a bunch of all of the seasonal stuff that goes on with Destiny scaling. So, I'm going to explain Oryx the character. Then I'm going to explain what the Hive are. They're very physiology, I mean. And then after that, I'm going to hit all the lore one at a time. So, um, you've been warned. This is your table of contents going into the video. So I'm going to go ahead and start on his lore.
These frail siblings will soon be claimed by the light. Unless we claim them first, we will tell the most cunning sibling of a cataclysm, a prophecy of great loss. We will feed her fear, her pride. We will say, young Sathona, the end is coming. A great cataclysm. A god wave. In the sky, there is only death. But salvation lies in the deep. Lead your sisters down. Your coming will spare their short lives. And you will be reborn, the Witch Queen.
They were tricked. The Hive were lied to.
So if you couldn't tell from the cutscene, things were not very cash money. The Krill lived on this planet called the Fundament. We're not sure where in the universe Fundament is. We know it's many, many star systems, many galaxies away from the solar system. That's literally all we know about it. So on this planet called the Fundament, you have asteroids, maybe moons, and other pieces of land that will all fly and just be a part of this planet. These things, called the worms, call a bunch of stuff to the planets, and eventually things grow there and adapt, and they form this ecosystem. So eventually this society, housed within this Osmium kingdom called the Krill, were not at all having a very fun time even amongst all the rabble there. So they could live for only 10 years or less because, again, they had predators, and they were very tiny and small, and basically the trash of their planet. So, eventually, all this happens because of one reason. So, prior to the Books of Sorrow is the story of Rolk. And somewhere in Rolk's story, he does an errand for the Witness, where he goes to where the worms are at. He meets this giant, literally continent-sized whale, that's what it's described to be. And the whale is like, yo, bruh, screw off, you're not cool. So, Rolk wasn't having his crap, he wanted the smoke, so he blew a hole into his body, tore a bone out, and basically said, see you buddy, have a nice day. So, after he basically yeeted the whale, he eventually went to Fundament, or wherever the worms are at this point. So, he saw that they were starving, maybe, probably, they're gonna die. It's insinuated that they were gonna die. We don't quite know if they were, but again, they probably were. They probably was, because that's what it was alluding to. So it's like, give me your mom, so she can power my giant machine of death, aka called the Upended. And as she powers my machine and basically feeds me power, in return, you're gonna have a lot of power, and you're going to have this thing called the sword logic. If you accept this power, you're not really gonna starve. You're gonna have a lot of strength, and it will be intense, right? So eventually, their mom takes the deal, so she goes and becomes this new power battery for Rolk's machine called the Upended. So fast forward, this worm's left on the shore because of Rolk, and the father of the siblings of the Osmium King is this dude that went mad studying the worm. So at some point prior to the story, he went nuts. We don't know how long prior to the story he went nuts, or how far into his madness he's in, but we know the dude just went bonkers, and like, you know, he never came back. So, he's told about this God Wave, you know, not very cash money for the Krill. So, you know, and eventually there's this caretaker of the 3 children of the Osmium King, called Tox. Now, what Tox does is gonna matter in a second. So, the Osmium King has 3 children, Orash, Zero, and Sathona. Orash was the curious child who liked knowing things. Zero wanted to become a general, you know, wanted to pick up a sword and fight and kill things. And that's what Zero wanted. She wanted war. Sathona knew things, wanted to learn more things. She wanted to become a mother so that she could have more of an impact from her life and live for a very, very long time. So these children were all very different, but they were all very, very quirky. So eventually, in this not very fun society that they live in, things eventually go even worse somehow, some way, when Tox, their caretaker, betrays them, kills the king, eventually takes over the place. So the 3 siblings had to go take a ship that, you know, one of them had, and they had to dip. So, for what was stated to be a year-long or longer voyage, they used Zero's tenacity into getting into situations, Sathona's deception, but they relied heavily upon it much more later. And then they relied on Oryx's, or at this point, Orash's ship to get them through. So, you know, on this year-long voyage that they've been on, they were trading things, you know, surviving. Eventually, they're not satisfied with this. They think that they're going to die in their short lives doing nothing. So, at this point is when the iconic thing that, like, everyone in the Destiny community talks about, you know, from the books. This is when the worms eventually start, you know, popping up. So, eventually, they get this giant ship. They start going underground. They start burrowing deep. Then they run into this whale. The same whale had his poor little bone taken out by Rolk, you know, so he's probably in a not very good state compared to even then. So he's telling them, yo, go back. These dudes are evil. Really, really evil. You don't know what kind of evil you're unlocking by going down there. But then the worms, you know, cheekily bring up how, like, their society is, like, totally and utterly in ruin. They're probably going to die. Things are only going to get harder. And that, you know, the sky wants to make things even harder. So there's like, you know what? The worms are right. Screw this guy. We're going to go deeper and just get our people out from this conundrum. So they go deeper, and eventually they run to the worms. So eventually things go from like very interesting to completely and utterly bonkers at this point. Let's just be honest. So they eventually run into these worms. They're called the 5, you know, honest, virtuous worms. There's 5 worm gods, and they offer power to the siblings. You know, the deal. So they're like, you take all these larvae, you know, our children, you know, on your ship. You eat all these, you know, you eat all these larvae. You know, you give them to your people. You know, and get a lot of power. So, guess what they do? You guessed right. They go and take the worms, and they go and devour the worms. So, eventually, they take these worms on their ship, for whatever they didn't devour, they gave to, like, other people. They start this revolt, finally. So, yeah. Things go from very intense to far, far more intense, very quickly. So, yeah, not a fun trip. So in chapter 2 is when things become more interesting. So in the first 3 chapters, they talk about the 3 siblings. They're like, oh, hey, young Savathun, we liked how you created mighty warriors and, knights and whatnot, and then made talks like, oh, crap, and she had to run away. So that's cool, right? So they keep it pretty brief with, Sathona. Then with Zero, she's like, oh, hey, yo, you're doing awesome. You like to conquer things, right? They keep blowing our ships up and crap. So I need you to go and slaughter those people and gain enough power. Because if we gain enough power, we can eventually just cut open space itself and just walk through and kill a bunch of stuff. And then with Oryx, because at this point, she became a male. I know. Not gonna say anything. Anyway, so, Oryx, at this point is a very smart person. How they're understanding the sword logic and getting more power. And so the worms are like, yo, are you beginning to understand that law does not matter to you? That you can warp it? That you can warp reality and stuff? That you can make your own laws? And like, talks about how like laws nothing, and how they're no longer bound by causal nature in any capacity. So this is already at the point of being type 4/type 5 acausal, because the worm gods. And then, immortal. So they become immortal, acausal, and they gain a bunch of powers and stuff. So, they're reality destroyers in a way, and they're able to cleave and annihilate things. So at this point, they use this knowledge they gain from the worms, and the strength they gain, to eventually come back and go after Tox. She runs away. She goes, into these things called the Ammonite. The Ammonite, are a race from Fundament that are warring, against the Hive at this point. And, Tox doesn't, like the Hive. She's like, yo, we need to get all the species of this planet against these guys, because they're gonna kill everything, basically. So, they all, try to murder the Hive. Or at least the Ammonite do. We know about the Ammonite. So, the Ammonite, we know about them because they're the fighting force that's up against the Hive. So, eventually they go after Tox. Well, at some point they failed. And Oryx was put in some depressive stoop. How, like, he can't really, be peaceful with anyone. He can't really, just alliance with people. He has to go and kill things. He has to go and do all this really messed up stuff for the sake of the final shape. And how Savathun needed to get him out of his stupor. So, eventually, at some point or another, at some point in the lore, Oryx gets out of his stupor, then goes after Tox, and then he dies. So at this point, he dies for the very first time, and in death, the worms teach him, magic seals and rituals, and this is when the Hive gain their magic. If they hadn't been able to before, then they can basically grab souls and yeet them from existence. They can, summon. They can do everything that you see with Hive magic, including with concepts and whatnot. Actually, it's at this point that Hive concepts, are quite literal, are in fact more than just simply abstract. This is the stuff that you hear about with some of the Ascendant Plane lore. Actually, let me go ahead and play one of those statements now.
Hive runes draw their power from a different dimension, where there's no difference between a word and its meaning. When the Hive erode the barrier between our dimension and theirs, the rune for death brings literal death.
So, at some point, Oryx is curious enough to go back to the worms. The worms give him power over magic, seals, and rituals. You know, what we call magic. So eventually he goes after Tox. He realizes that, oh crap, Tox wasn't on the Dry Moon. And then sometime after that, Savathun kills him. We don't know when, we just know Savathun kills him. Eventually, he comes back. After he gets killed, the worms give him the ability to infinitely revive, along with his other two siblings. They go and wage war on the Amanite. At some point, they go and kill the Amanite. After they kill the Amanite, including the Leviathan Beast, they can now continue on as Hive and, you know, act normal. So, eventually, we go to the next part of the books, which is the third saga. So, in the third saga, things are pretty dire from the start. So, firstly, things are okay-ish. You know, they eventually got done killing the Amanite. Now they go and train with each other because Savathun reminds Oryx that she went and killed his ass before, you know, they went and killed the Amanite. So they eventually pick up where they left off, and they fought and killed each other in every unspeakable, horrendous way possible for the last 20,000 years straight. So, needless to say, they amp each other very extremely here. So, anyway, after they're done training with each other, they eventually create these courts. They have each of their own court. Oryx has a court called the High War, where it's a killing ground, essentially a school of the sword logic, where you go and practice the sword logic. Savathun, she has a kingdom called the High Coven. The High Coven is essentially where she puts all the witches and all the wizards and all the magicians like Hive, where they go and practice magic, where they're essentially a part of her coven. Xivu Arath has a court, but it's war. That means that any place within the multiverse, if there is a war, it is her killing ground, her territory, her dominion, if you will. So, Xivu Arath technically has a court on any ground that it can fit in, if it's battle. So, eventually they create these kingdoms, and they swell with power. They even say this themselves in the lore, that it swells with power, that they gain so much power eventually over time after doing this. So, at some point is whenever their worms actually then begin to surpass them. Because the worms are starting to surpass them, that means the power they gain from killing and every other thing they gain to feed the worms is now no longer working. The worms are eating too much, they cannot power the worms, they are growing weaker, they are afraid that they will permanently die. Okay, so again, not very cash money for the Hive, because they're going to die, they don't want to end up how they was as Krill, so they think of a plan, they start spouting off ideas. Savathun's like, oh, you know, you could have some power. So Xivu Arath is like, yo, you could get a lot of power from killing me because I'm really strong. So Oryx cuts her head off. Savathun's like, yeah, you can, you know, get power. And then, you know, as soon as you get power, you can go and do whatever you want, basically. So eventually, well, he cuts her head off too. So at this point is when the popular part of the books happen. Oryx climbs down into the deep, and then he finds Worm God Akka. Worm God Akka is the worm god who is the keeper of secrets. Akka has the ability to commune with the darkness. But his ability in specific is a form of truth manipulation, where he can decide if things are lies or if they're truths. It's a very, very fundamental ability on the level of even existence itself, where if something is a lie, it's essentially non-existent, where if it's a lie, it's a form of existence in the truth that it takes. So it's a very strong ability, and along with that, Oryx just wants a lot of power. So he wants a gift from Akka, and he's like, yo, I don't give things. So Oryx is like, yo, I know you don't give things. That is, you know, that is the sword logic. We take what we want. So eventually, he draws his sword and does battle with Akka and has a war of words. And at some point at the end of the battle, he killed Akka. So at this point is when he kills Akka. He mantles the crown of the Taken King. He's now a god. So Oryx, the Tinkin King, is finally born. This is when Oryx actually starts to arrive at his apex of power. An apex so mighty that something very, very important happens later in the story that actually contributes. That happens in Destiny 1. If you guys know what I'm talking about, then you probably realize what's going on at this point of the story. Oryx comes back as a god, and he starts doing some crazy stuff. Crazy stuff I will now begin to read to you now. So, for the last 4th and 5th saga of the books, it mainly focuses on Oryx, so there's a lot less content here in the last part of the books to go over. So at this point, Oryx has gained the ability to make speeches to the deep / witness because he killed Akka. Now he's ready to go and take on the Akumine again. He goes and takes on the Akumine. He wars with them for 100 years. Xivu comes back. They war on the Akumine for 40 years. Savathun comes back. They war on them for another 1,000 years. They win. So, at this point, Oryx is like, yo, we're at the edge of the deep. I can feel it. So he goes and talks to the witness, which at this point, we learn that Oryx finally has gained the power to take. So, he comes back, with the power to take. He's stepping around in this throne world, and it's talking about, how the High War is like going after and just murdering the Tashabethi. So, it's that one where it talks about how Oryx is walking around in 10 paces. So it's one chapter of them going after, the Tashabethi. So after they go after the Tashabethi, sometime between them, between that and prior to that, Xivu and Savathun, try to cripple and go after Oryx and nerf him. He goes after them, stops them from crippling him. Sometime after, he wages war on the Tashabethi, and, he deals with the siblings. He's like, I feel like having some kids. So, he shacks up with a Hive wizard sometime later in the future. He has a bunch of kids. You know who they are. Nakaris, Crota, the 2 daughters, probably a bunch of other kids that we don't know. So, Oryx has a bunch of kids, and eventually a bunch of nonsense happens, after that. So, at this point, the siblings are still waging war on each other, but Oryx is more focused on his family specifically. So, at this point, Oryx decides to grow a new pair of wings. The daughters are experimenting with death and giving themselves more immortality. Oryx is telling Crota, yo, you need to go and act like your sisters. Then eventually Savathun does her thing where she opens up the gate where the Vex want to go and invade. The Hive are warring with the Vex. The Vex, who are being led by Quoria. Quoria, who's had 100 local years of prep inside Oryx's own world, is now stalemating the Hive. So Crota's like, yo, my man, there's chaos here. So Oryx comes back, and then it's a 2-part assault against Quoria. So at this point, he comes back, he stops the Hive from coming into his throne, and deals with them. Locks them into space, so they can be taken, basically ends the first part of the invasion. Tells Crota, yo, my man, you're gonna go to the Vex homeworld and go berserk, or you're never coming back. So he grabs him by the legs and chucks his ass through the gate, where Crota then, wages war for like a very, very long time on the Vex. So, now, coming back to this scenario, he's like, okay, now time to deal with my ship. So, Oryx then creates a living contradiction in reality, where now at this point, he's actually able to, using the power of the Hive also, because it's not by himself that he does this. This part is also explicit. Where it's mostly him, and then there's some support from the Hive, where he turns his throne world into the ship. The ship, which is his dreadnought, is now his throne world, and it's now a contradiction of sorts, of both material and non-physical states. So, at this point, is where Oryx is now actually shown his power to create and sustain contradictions, and allow them to be reality. So, pretty strong, right? I mean, I would agree it'd be pretty strong. But anyway, so, at some point, this thing called a gift mast happens. Well, actually, before that, we're gonna go back to Korya's second version of an attack on Oryx. There's not really anything to say about it. Korya tries to surprise Oryx on his ship. Because he's going after the niche thought ship. The niche thought ship actually turned out to be a trap, which was Korya trying to surprise Oryx again. That didn't happen. Oryx literally ignored Korya's attempts to emulate him into existence, and basically is like, okay, you're trash. And basically gave him the Savathun, as a gift of sorts. So, after he gives Korya the Savathun, then we can eventually go to the Gift Mast. And the Gift Mast is where eventually Oryx just has so much overwhelming might, so much overwhelming power, that the two siblings are like, okay, yo, Oryx, we need to go and do our own thing, you're too strong. So Xivu Wrath takes her War Moons and the rest of her Hive, they go into a black hole. Savathun, takes her Hive, and her High Coven and stuff, they go all the way into their own black hole, and they close, and then Oryx is by himself finally. So at this point is when Oryx is just the strongest within the books, just blatantly ignoring the witness. So anyway, moving on. Now in the last part of the book, it's not really anything that matters all that much. I mean, again, it's mainly focusing on Oryx, how he's like, okay, Tox is my problem. Trying to, continue the sword logic, and to practice it and continue to take shape, allow it to take form through us performing the act of killing. That is our responsibility. Tox is my problem. And then eventually it's revealed at the end of the books that, yo, you collected all of these to create a weapon, which is me. So I put my very being in these books. Because you're starting to understand me, you're invoking my name. So eventually it's then revealed that the Books of Sorrow, which was written by Oryx and contributed to by his other two siblings at select points, was actually the story of the Hive. So this is why here at the end of the books is actually sound. Because it turns out Oryx wrote the majority of the books, and whatever his siblings contributed to, you can maybe argue contradictions with. But it's revealed that at the very least what Oryx wrote, that's truth. So, now that you understand the Books of Sorrow, in mostly their entirety, let's go ahead and move on to what the Hive are in their entirety. In the question of Hive physiology, there's only really two answers that can be provided to you. The first of which is that one time, they were an insignificant race called the Krill. Now, I say insignificant because at one time they lived on a planet called the Fundament. The Fundament was a very, very long distance away from our solar system, even in different galaxies at a very different point in the universe, very far away. On this planet, they were more or less the garbage of their own world. If you went into the wild, chances are you probably didn't come back. Even so, even if you were to not go into the wilds whatsoever, and you stayed home and did all that stuff, you'd still only live at 10 years old. So, pretty insignificant, pretty trash race. If you want to make a comparison, it's probably something like Gorda Godbutcher from Marvel, if you know about his backstory. The other half of the answer, or the other answer in this case, would be is that they eventually became the Hive. The Hive are essentially now creatures of the dark, where they became, from the Krill to these dark Krill, or the Hive. They are these collective consciousness sort of creatures, where they mostly reside in the infinite, or the Ascendant. They don't really like going into reality, because it's very difficult for their forms to maintain themselves between the throne world and the real world, which is the reason why you always see trash Hive in the real world. That's because that's probably how strong they would be as Krill. So, ignoring the fact that they're garbage in the physical universe, the Hive are these creatures of dark who manage to overcome causality. They can change laws, and they are immortal, and that you cannot kill them via out-aging them. They will out-age you. Probably the concept of your age also, and every other concept of you after that. So they can live for a very long time, much like the Vex. So, The very simple answer that you want, though, is that the Hive are basically space shrimp. And they went from being trash space shrimp to immortal, very unstoppable, genocidal, evil space shrimp. Yes, yes, that is what the Hive is. If you really want a very dumbed down answer, they are in fact space shrimp. Um, there is a whole lot that goes on with the Hive, so let me explain the hierarchy of the Hive now that you sort of know what the first part of the question that you even want to ask is. To keep it very short, if you want to know the core purpose of the Hive as a collective, see, they're in a collective consciousness, so it makes things very easy to talk about when they're on the battlefield amongst each other. But the Hive, they exist mostly to generate power and tribute for, the Witness, Rolk as an extension via the Worm Gods. But the Hive as a collective, they're actually mostly a slave race. So the Hive, they willingly go and commit death across the entire universe, literally for the sake of the Witness. So, uh, as a race, they're very occult, very fanatical-like. Uh, in scale. That's how they do things. In a way, that's how the race is actually modeled. They're very fanatical, very death-oriented. So when we analyze the Hive, we have to realize that they're all bonkers. They're all inherently bonkers. They're literally brainwashed, and they want to kill things. So as I go up the hierarchy, this very same theme is going to remain. It's just going to become more and more fundamentally obvious and clear regarding the Hive. So now, starting with the Hive, we'll start with the Thrall. If you know what the definition of a Thrall is, it means, mindless slave, weakling, fanatical, right? Something of a background character, a grunt. A Thrall, they will mostly prey and eat and try to gain power and reward tribute to their gods and, have tribute for themselves. Very simple, very insignificant even in terms of the Hive. Now, going up the chain a bit is something called an Acolyte. Acolytes are a bit more interesting. We actually see that they have eyes finally. They seem to develop tactics where they don't go and run at the player, where they fire their weapons or they'll go and hit you if they're close to you. But generally speaking, they're at ranges that would favor them and they try to hit you with attacks and they go in behind cover. Acolytes, they're a stronger version of Thrall, but they're different. They're more intelligent. They have gained enough tribute to go up the chain a bit, so now they're no longer mere trash. So, very strong as a Hive, and typically you'll see them with void weapons. Now, going up the chain a bit more, this will depend on where you go as a Hive. You could become a wizard, or you could become a knight. A wizard, they're the mothers that you see. They live for very long periods of time. Even in regards to the Krill, mothers live for a long time. That's how they live. They go and they raise Thrall and other Hive below them, and they essentially act as leaders of sorts of their groups. Group leaders. They would go, give orders and do all that. Knights, on the other hand, they're on the same level as a wizard. But whereas say wizards are more insignificant in terms of raw power, they in fact have magic and whatnot. They can tear your soul out. They can mostly manipulate you as if they are using the Force. We actually saw this with Navoda. So they can effectively tear souls out. They have arc spells. And they're very annoying to kill due to their tendency to hover and float and, even fly. On the other hand, you have the Knights. The Knights are the complete and utter opposite of wizards. Now, keep this in mind. This is not a gender difference, as the Hive are actually gender fluid as a race. So do not make any mistake. Xivu Arath acts like a knight. She is a knight, and Xivu Arath is a she, and she's a knight. So don't think they're gender locked, because they're not. In fact, it's the very opposite of that. With knights, they are more physically dominant, and you'll see different variations of knights. You'll see knights with swords and shields. You'll see knights merely just wanting to use swords. You'll see knights using dual swords. You'll see knights using boomers and other ranged attacks. But typically, knights will follow similar patterns. They'll either act like stronger acolytes, or they'll be more aggressive and in your face. They're more difficult to deal with on the battlefield because they're significantly more durable even compared to an acolyte. So, wizards are more hacksy, knights are more annoying with their persistence on the battlefield. Now, going past the knights and the wizards, you have something called ogres. Ogres are basically mutated thrall that basically have gone off the deep end, and like they eventually just became their own thing. They act like Brainstorm from Ben 10, where they go and fire crap at your face. It's typically void attacks that you see from ogres. They're more annoying to kill compared to knights. They have more range than a wizard, and they're very, very annoying once they see you. They will try to kill you. They're very persistent, even more so than knights. They will slam in your face. They will fire blast. They'll keep running after you. You have to focus your attention on them, even compared to other Hive, if you hope to survive on the battlefield against ogres. Now, ignoring that, we of course, have Shriekers. Shriekers, it's not really known, even to the Hive fully, if they're mere avatars or vessels, or if they're in fact something else like eyes. We know for sure that Xivu Arath and Savathun can use Shriekers as like actual extensions of themselves in terms of sight and maybe other perceptions. But we don't know if Hive can manipulate Shriekers to the same degree that the gods can. Now, I'd rather not have a debate on whether or not Shriekers, can be manipulated by knights or ogres or other forms of Hive. I don't know that. I don't think we have an answer to that. I don't think we want to debate that. But basically, Shriekers act as eyes, sentry turrets. In the game, the code is vehicles. So, make of that what you will. So, as a race, the Hive maintain who they are as a race, from the plane to the physical universe. And we actually got a new statement this season regarding on why they, change in power from the physical universe to the plane. Marasov explained that it's very hard to maintain your form. Your will has to be very strong in order to maintain itself. In order to keep your form between the plane and the physical universe. So, this is explained by someone who actually had to go through the Ascendant plane herself, and then go all the way back to the universe. And then, as of recently, she actually got into a scuffle with Xivu Arath. So, if that statement's referring to the fact that Xivu Arath is at full power both in the physical universe and in the plane, that's a pretty scary notion. But this isn't really a Xivu Arath video, although, Oryx has the same tenacity as Xivu Arath. Anyway, so the statement is sound, but I'll go ahead and link that below. Anyway, so, in order for me to explain the difference between Physical Hive and Ascendant Hive, let me play a statement from Season of the Lost that Petrovenge actually gave us to explain how the universe works.
Queen Mara has already told you we must recover our lost Techians in order to free Savathun from her servitude to the worm gods. I will tell you how. Imagine the universe as a set of coins, stacked, one on top of the other. The top coin is our reality. The bottom, the Ascendant plane. Between them lies an intermeshing of ever-shifting pathways, known as ley lines. Almost all the ancient pathways are now defunct, but beings of paracausal ability can navigate and rebuild them. This is the art of wayfinding. We know our lost Techians are stranded somewhere among the ley lines, and they're leaving us markers to follow. I'm forwarding you the coordinates to the first marker. It should tell us which ley line to look in. Then we'll use the blind well to tear open a rift and send you through to find them. Xivu Arath is desperate to capture her sister. Her forces, which now include the Taken, will attempt to stop you at every turn. Listen, I know your crow intends to accompany you. Mara also wants him close. Our Techians went to retrieve Queen Mara on my orders. This can't fail. Not because of him.
So, Petrovenge gave us a statement about the universe being a stack of coins. What does that mean? I'll explain. So, in the physical universe, we have things that we can measure, such as dimension, shape, form, space, time. We have conventional measurement. We can measure height, we see shadows, we see light. They're all things that we know about, right? Gravity. Again, they're all things we know about, but they're things that are measurable here in the universe. In the universe, there's not only the physical universe, but also the Ascendant plane. The Ascendant plane, that is the complete and utter opposite of the physical universe. In the physical universe, we think of things conventionally as physically. In the Ascendant, it's quite the opposite. We have to look at things metaphysically. Now, if you don't know what metaphysics is, which is probably most people watching the video, that's okay. I studied it enough to know the topic enough just to make the video. So, part of the reason why I didn't want to make an Oryx video, but here we go. So, metaphysics contains philosophy, it contains sciences, it contains all forms of mathematics, which are variations of sciences, it contains all religions, and more or less it contains everything that is beyond the conventional scope of measurement. Now, the reason why this matters is because within metaphysical philosophy, there's this thing called ontology. Ontology is the very study of being, existence itself. It quite literally is the most fundamental form of philosophical scaling you could use to get to high universal or extraversal. Again, I'm not going to debate the terms because it's more to focus on the Oryx video, not a scaling video. So, anyway, it's the most, fundamental scale possible, regardless of the terms you want to use. In Destiny, you can have high hyperversal scaling, but you can have ontological potency. In Destiny, hacks and power is very, very different. What you can output as a form of strength is very different than what you could output as, say, a spell or an ability. Now, Guardians can control the area of effect of their abilities, same with Hive, but in conventional measurement, hacks and their output is very, very different. So what we're looking at right now is the potency. The potency you can reach is the same potency that can be used on Atheon. It's the same potency you can argue for Panoptes. It's the same potency you could argue for even weakened variations of Crota. It's more or less a very common thing you see in Destiny. Ontology. There's statements for it in the Books of Sorrow. You probably see it on the screen now. At least one or two statements. And then we have statements from one of the Taken Techians from Last Wish using an ontological attack. So, now, here's the thing with the Hive and other characters in Destiny. You can eventually go from not only having ontological potency, but even more fundamental ontological potency, but you also have ontological scaling. So, to keep it simple, in the Ascendant plane, you have these throne worlds. These throne worlds exist in a stack pattern. You have Ascendant Hive of different classes, naturally which would vary even amongst themselves based on the race of Hive that is the Ascendant in question. Because you can have an Ascendant Ogre, you can have an Ascendant Acolyte, etc., etc. So, you start from being infinitely greater than the Hive, below you. And the Hive above you would be far more fundamentally, even transcendentally beyond what you could ever perceive before that. And that's just for infinites. It's this way for infinite. how it's utterly and completely transcendental, even beyond an inaccessible type measurement. But for the Hive, they measure it as infinite. So even though it's basically an inaccessible / immeasurable type of measurement, it's what the Hive consider as infinite. And there's many levels of stacking for these infinite throne worlds. Eventually, you go beyond what the Hive view as infinite, and eventually what they view as inaccessible. At this point, it's more or less the same rule. You know, different races, or I'm sorry, not different races, but different variations of Hive. Although different races can use sword logic and can have throne worlds, this is not the focus. But do keep that in mind. Anyway, the rule's mostly the same with the Hive. They still have these thrones, they still stack, and they all vary in power, and that there's a beyond infinite amount of them also. These throne worlds are utterly transcendental in the way they stack each other, to even a conceptual degree. So it's not only just an inaccessible difference; it's actually like an outer-versal or higher difference at least, with just an individual stack alone, right, within the inaccessibles. Same with the infinites, but you know, eventually you arrive to the gods. The gods utterly and completely dwarf even to such a capacity that what I said was utterly and completely insignificant to the gods. The gods utterly and completely dwarf any and all Hive, Ascendant or not. The Hive gods, it's a very broad tier amongst itself. In the Hive gods, you have Nokris, you have Crota, you have the Daughters of Oryx. There's the 1 or 2 Lost Sector bosses we know about that are children of Xivu Arath or Savathûn, or both. So it's a very broad tier. They're very strong or they're very weak, but they're all Hive gods, so they're utterly and completely transcendental of other Hive. So, the Hive gods, they're very significant in where they scale. The thing is with the gods, is that the gods are now transcended by the top 3, which is Oryx, Xivu Arath, and Savathûn. Oryx is the Hive god of curiosity and understanding, and to a certain extent, death. Xivu Arath is the Hive god of war. Quite literally, in fact. Savathûn is the Hive god of cunning and lies. So earlier in the video, I mentioned something called ontology. Well, let me talk about where ontology is from. So, in metaphysics, there's actually generally 4 tiers. You have concepts, principles, systems, axioms. A concept is any and all things that are a concept. Any and all things you can think of that are the word concept that are not outerversal to the highest extent possible of outerversal, that would be a concept. You can argue the extent of which they all are, but they all fit into this one category of concept. A principle is a higher type concept that acts as the will of a system. It's essentially, well, a principle, right? A rule. So, a principle scales and completely transcends concepts. A system, on the other hand, if you think of any philosophy or anything by name, that in of itself is a system. By name. That system has a set of concepts and principles that it uses to guide itself within its functions as a philosophy, science, etc., etc. That's what a system is. Systems are predicated on these things called axioms. Axioms are the very beliefs themselves that make up everything. When you have a set of beliefs, you will construct systems and principles and ideas to convey these axioms. That's how you get metaphysics. They keep it very simple for the Hive so that I don't make this too long. How the Hive work is that you can be a concept type being and have principle level manipulation. You could be a principle level being and have system manipulation. You could be a system level being and have axiom manipulation. Or you can be an axiom being and have even more fundamental axiom manipulation. That's how it works with the Hive. And that in the Hive, in the Throne Worlds, each of the Throne Worlds contains 11 of these ontological level axioms. That's why when I make the scaling argument for axioms and then I translate them to Throne Worlds, you'll generally think of those as a mind cosmos that contains 11 ontology class axioms. So that's what I mean by a Throne World or a mind cosmos. Or in this case, the axiom scaling for Oryx. So for the question of scaling, it goes like this. You know Oryx is at the top of the Hive hierarchy to a certain extent. We know that at some point Savathun surpassed him in the hierarchy because of the collapse. So we know that he was at the top for a very long time. What we didn't know was that he was at the top until the collapse era. So this means that what we know about Oryx is that Savathun surpassed him a long time ago, although we didn't know the gap, so the debate between them, was what was the difference, and then what we would always get is that Savathun, outside of her throne world, would probably die to Oryx in a fight, due to the fact that she doesn't like, open confrontation. So, Savathun, in the throne world, though, is a very different story. She'd be able to beat Oryx because she'd be outright more powerful. The debate at that point would be, how many amps would Oryx have to get in order to rival Savathun, which would follow the scaling arguments. So, against someone like Savathun of all people, to have potential to keep up, and for a Paraverse version to outright annihilate, this means that Oryx is a very strong, very, very broken character. Listen, you have versions of Oryx, in Paraverse scaling, where you can argue that he can take on Rolk. You can argue that, again, he can take on someone like Savathun. There might even be versions you can argue that can take on, say, Callus. Definitely Mind Callus, because Mind Callus is weaker than, Lightfall Callus, but Oryx, he scales insanely high from the get-go. And we know that Paraverse, Oryx exists because Paraverse Crota exists. So, and while we could argue the same for other characters, it just goes to show that Oryx is a very, very broken character. At this point, Oryx is still within his tier. He hasn't really changed within the scaling. It's just that now he's going to be going up against other characters within his tier, but he's going to win or lose for different reasons. He's going to win for different reasons, and he's going to lose for different reasons. So he has strengths and weaknesses, like other characters in his tier. It just now he has to fight to keep his place in the tier, compared to before, where we didn't actually know there's characters that can take him on, because we weren't that far in the story yet. So, he's a very dominant character. Matter of fact, Oryx was even stated by the witness to be more wrathful than Rolk, because the statement is referring to Zebra Wrath and Oryx. So, at some point, if you gave Oryx enough time, he could probably become the very pinnacle of his tier. And we're ignoring Paraverse scaling for this. So, yeah, don't fuck with Oryx. He's going to run your fade and laugh at you as you pitifully try to escape the dimension of darkness. So, yeah. Now I'm just going to hacks. So, Oryx has a lot of hacks. So, I'm not going to talk about every single power he has because that would take a long time to talk about, and this is already a long enough video. So, if you want to know about all of his powers, just comment down below and maybe I'll throw them in some Hive hacks video that I could do alongside, say, a Guardian video. So, Oryx has a lot of abilities. He has the ability to infinitely revive. He has the ability to grab your mind, body, souls, concept, even narrative. You know, that's what his power can affect. He can grab your soul, he can devour it, quite literally. His daughter said he could. He has the ability to command you to die. He ignores any and all causal nature entirely. Not only can he infinitely revive, he has this type of immortality that works like Doomsday from DC, where if you kill him with a specific object or method, that same method or object cannot kill him again. So, that's another form of immortality. Then he has another form of immortality, which is parasitic immortality. His parasitic immortality allows him to put his true death inside of, say, another object, which he threw inside the weapon Touch of Malice. So he was killed, but he wasn't gone. So that's another form of immortality. And then besides that, he has physical immortality, where even, you know, with fatal injuries, it's very hard to kill him, or even hurt him that much. You have to hurt Oryx on a level that he can't recover from, in order to, like, actually get around his immortality, because he has a lot of immortalities, and they only get stronger. Not only that, but he's also a Hive god of curiosity and understanding. So if you try to learn and understand things, you invoke Oryx's name. So as a result, you empower him. So if you try to understand and adapt to Oryx on the battlefield, that will actually do the opposite and instead make him stronger and probably make you weaker. So he can actually use his concepts in many, many ways. So not only does he have hacks like that, he also has other abilities. Where, again, you know, he can warp causal nature itself into the way he wants it to. He's actually physically walked across the Ascendant plane in finite time. He can casually ignore madness, manip, and existential erasure from the plane because he lives in it. He exists abstractly because he's not a physical god either, like Savathûn. He's technically the god of death because he's a sword logic god. So he also can invoke death because of his concept, instead of just commanding you to die. He has these things called Annihilator Totems, which the Annihilator Totems allow him to mass widespread annihilate his foes from existence, like he can with his Willbreaker sword and his throne ship. Not only does he have the Annihilator Totems, but he also has the ability to summon Hive, who can use Annihilator Totems, like say wizards. Not only can he summon those Hive, he could say summon the High War. High War that would involve, say, Crota. He could summon the War Priest. He could even summon Golgoroth or even the two daughters. He could even, you know, summon someone else if he wanted to. They would follow him. He's their god. So, ignoring that, what's his other abilities? Well, he has teleportation. He has various types of magic spells. He can drain you of your powers. Not only of your powers, but he can also drain your very super. He does that in Destiny 1. He has the ability to fly. His sword Willbreaker ignores space itself, so he doesn't have to cut you while the sword is out to cut you. So he has incredible spatial control with it. His sword Willbreaker also bypasses distance in a way. So he doesn't really need to touch you either to cut you. Not only does he not need to touch you, he doesn't need to have his sword out. So the sword can just bypass space entirely and just cut you regardless of your defenses. More or less, it depends if you can resist it, but then that would call into question the Taken King scaling, yada yada. But ordinarily, you'd see with Oryx using the Willbreaker, it's pretty much going to kill anyone that it cuts. So, pretty much treat it like Yamato from Devil May Cry. He has the ability to say throw his true death into other things, again like his parasitic immortality. So say he could pull out your true death and say put it into a teacup, he could just stomp on the teacup and you'd be gone. Not only that, but because Guardians have been able to show the ability to fight actual ghosts, we know Oryx, because he's a god of the same type Crota is, he's his father after all, we know he's able to physically grab and interact with ghosts in the same manner you'd see Sauron from Lord of the Rings do. So, Oryx has a lot of other abilities. So what about other sub-hacks, stuff that you probably should mention but haven't already? Good question. So I already mentioned flight and his other stuff, but I should mention that he's extremely intelligent. You can make the argument that Savathun is smarter than him because she found a riddle that he hadn't solved, but I don't think Oryx would care anyway, because he was a servant of the witness anyhow. So he's extremely comparable, at least, to Savathun in intelligence. We don't know if he's outright smarter or if he's outright more ignorant, because it was never really clearly stated. It just Savathun always believed herself to be smarter, because she hid her power from Oryx. And also because she believed herself to be more intelligent through cunning and lies. So that's another thing to keep in mind with Oryx. And then, he has some very, very potent stuff also. So, with his ability to take, see again, it does a lot of things. Taking, it's a composition will manip. He can essentially kill whoever he kills. He gains their abilities and all their experiences. He becomes them. They become one with him as he kills them. He doesn't have to kill them though to assimilate them. He can take you and they can essentially assimilate people into his design. The reason why that matters is because he absorbed Riven of 1,000 voices, and as a result, he more or less gained Ahamkara power. Now, if you want to somehow debate Oryx being able to transcend death, he literally absorbed an Ahamkara and he became Touch of Malice, so I don't see why he wouldn't transcend death in that instance. We can also talk about him just having death transcendent immortality, where he can just outright ignore death. So there's also that. So, like, Oryx has a lot of other powers to talk about. Like, I could talk about him just throwing Crota into holes. I could talk about him just ripping open portals in space, but there's so much stuff to go over with Oryx that I could probably just make a whole other video on hacks entirely. Like, not going to lie. Oryx has a lot of very potent powers, so don't take the man lightly whatsoever. He's pretty scary. So let's go ahead and end the video. So that's the video. Now, I'm sure I can include a lot more details and stretch this out a bit more, but I don't want to stretch this out forever, and I guarantee you I know I missed some stuff that you can comment below, so feel free to. Anyway, so that's the video. Comment below who you want me to scale next, and I'll go ahead and get to that sometime, in the new year. Anyway, my name is Nothing Important here. I hope you guys have a wonderful Merry Christmas, and I hope you all have a wonderful New Year, and I'll see y'all next year with my new set of projects. Bye-bye.